Today is June 28th, 2009. I am Andrea Mott. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Richardson, North Dakota. Can you please state your full name, including maiden name?
Melfrieda, Mary Ann Dahl Hauck.
And when and where were you born?
I was born at Bluegrass, North Dakota.
And what year was that?
In 1931, and Bluegrass is about 15 miles north of New Salem.
And have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
No. My grandmother lived about a half a mile from us, and she was a midwife, so she was always there. And then they always called the doctor, which was Dr. Gaby from New Salem, that would come and do the delivery in the home.
So you were born in the home then?
In the home, yes.
And can you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
That's pretty hard to do. Well, I was born into a large family. I had 4 older brothers and 2 older sisters. And so getting the name Melfrieda, in no time, we ended up having a nickname, which mine got to be Millie. And to begin with, they all had real German names down the line, and they all have nicknames today. So, and my earliest memory is of having real long dark hair, and it was naturally curly with a lot of locks. So they used to, when I started school, I used to have that brushed every morning. And my mother or my older sister would take a brush and they'd brush the curls around their finger to make the locks fall into place and stuff like that. And I hated to have my hair brushed. I'd cry and all that because it was always so tangled, because otherwise, while I was home during the weekend or during the summer or something, I wouldn't let anybody brush my hair until they absolutely had to. And it really didn't get cut then until I was in the first or second grade. It must have been the first grade. One evening, my mother and my sister did the milking with the cows that were there in the evenings. Well, the rest of them, I guess, were out in the field. But we happened to come home, and my dad was sitting in a chair with the scissors, and he kind of had a bowl that he kind of put over my head, but it didn't fit. But then he had me sit down in between his knees, or on his knees, and he started clipping those hair of mine, and he clipped them to the neckline, you know, real short. And they were long all the way down, probably. And when my mother and sister came into the house, they just cried, because here all those beautiful locks were laying on the floor, and I had a haircut.
What did you think of it?
Well, after I looked in the mirror the next day, I know I wore a stocking cap to school. I wore it all day long in school for the next couple of weeks or so. But I soon got over it and realized I could take care of my own hair. Just comb it and be done with it.
So it became a lot easier for you to manage after
Yes,
that,
it was,
that
yeah.
haircut.
Yeah.
What made you trust your father to cut your hair?
He didn't ask me, and he didn't say anything. He just had me sit on his knees, you know, and then started clipping away. It didn't take him very long to take a scissors and cut all the way around on my neck, you know, and dropped all those hair onto the floor.
And what was your father's name?
John.
And where was he born?
He was born in Katherine, Russia.
And what kind of a man was he? Can you describe him for us?
Oh, I'd say he was about 5'9" tall, heavier set, so that I remember, and very strong hands and very strong bodily wise, because we lived on a farm which they had to clear the fields a lot for rocks. There were an awful lot of rocks up in that area. And so that, I remember him doing a lot of that. And then farming and progressing as he went along in the farming business, because he got to be quite an outstanding farmer by the time he quit.
So how many years did he farm then?
Well, I only remember when they lived at Bluegrass, because that's where I was born, but they had to live over in the St. Vincent area before that, and I think in 1928, or before that, 27, I should have looked at that paper I had when he bought that land, which was north of the New Salem area called Bluegrass. Bluegrass was the name of our post office, and so that's where we got the mail from. And then Otter Creek was, about 3 miles north of us yet, and that's where the schoolhouse was that we went to school.
And can you describe the schoolhouse that you attended?
It was quite a large schoolhouse, and it was up on a hill, and it had all eight grades and a teacher, and pot-belly stove in the middle, like all country schoolhouses. All the windows in the schoolhouse were to the west, and the door was to the east. And my first grade teacher was, first and second grade teacher was Eckert Hyde, and he later on got to be a professor of music at Dickinson State College. And I was in the first grade with 4 boys and myself, so he really treated me nice. He would give me sled rides and stuff like that, which they would do for a little girl.
And what did you want to be when you grew up at that time?
I don't think I ever thought about it. I just loved being, with my family members and my classmates and going to school. I love school. And I couldn't speak a word of English when I started. I had to learn English because German was the only language taught at home. And up until my mother and father both passed away, they spoke to us in German, and we would answer them in English. And so that's how you started school too, you knew the German, but you didn't know the English. And then by the time I started the first grade, I just had 3 older brothers that were still going to school too, and then they taught me how to count with rocks on the way to school, to add and subtract. They were always helping me out, trying to teach me to learn and to read and all that, because one of them was in the, let me see, they would have been, 3rd grade and 5th grade and 7th grade when I started. Matt was the youngest, Lee and Joe.
And what did you like the most about school?
Learning to read. I just loved to read. And then I remember one of my very first books that I got to be my own was, the name of it was Heidi. There were movies made of it then later on. And I remember reading that book until the pages fell apart.
Were there any other books that you remember reading that you really enjoyed?
I remember getting a blackboard that you could write on with chalk, and you learn to write and write the numbers and the ABCs and all that. I remember having one of those when I started school.
So what would you say your favorite subject was?
At that time, like I say, probably reading.
And how did you usually get to school? Did you walk or sled or?
Well, there was a buggy that they used with one horse on it, during the nice days. And then during the winter, when the snow was really heavy, they hitched the same horse onto a covered sled, which was covered completely with a window in the front and a door in the back. And you could sit into that. It kind of had two benches in it. And but like I say, my brothers, those three older brothers, they hated hitching up this horse and everything. They'd sooner walk. And so they would pull me on a sled during the winter time. I would hold the 4 lunch buckets and sit on a long sleigh, and then they'd pull me, take turns pulling me to school because they could walk across the lake that would be, covered with ice at the time, and take shortcuts getting to school.
And you said you mentioned the lunch pails. What were those, and what kind of
Those lunch pails were usually syrup containers, buckets, a gallon bucket with a cover on it, and before that there was Karo syrup in them. And they would have sandwiches in it, an apple or an orange, or some cookies. And that'd usually be our lunch for the day, and we each had a separate container with our lunch.
So you became the one in charge of the food when they...
Right, just to hold on to them while they would pull the sleigh, I'd keep them kind of in between my legs and hold on to them, and they would pull me.
Was it a pretty small sled?
No, it was a pretty large sled. It would hold, 3, 4 people if you sat on it.
And can you describe the attendance situation at the school? Did that change according to the seasons?
Yes, it did. I think at times we would have 20 to 25 students in that school because, like I say, they usually had all 8th grades. And then when I got to be in the 5th and 6th grade already, it started then, it was during the wartime. They had a hard time keeping a teacher. We'd barely have a teacher, and they'd up and quit. And so I ended up then, for the 7th and 8th grade that I went to school at St. Joseph's grade school in Mandan, and I stayed with an aunt of mine. And the first year, my sister, my one younger sister next to me, Maggie, she stayed there too. And then I did finish the 7th and 8th grade, but some of them got to go to school, back out in the country school. And then in 1945, the year I was going to start as a freshman in high school, and my brother, older than me, 2 years older, he already was going to high school in New Salem. And then my parents came to Richardson for a field mass. And my mother had relatives that lived in Richardson, so they were kind of acquainted with the place. And on the same day, going to a field mass, which would have been in July, they bought a house and decided to enter us all in the school. And so my 2 younger sisters, being they had so little school on the country school, they started, the 1st grade all over again. I think it was One of them was in the second grade, one of them in the first grade. And then, our brother went, my one old, that was just older than myself, he went to the Assumption Abbey, and I started. We moved into the house over the weekend. All the furniture was in the back of a truck, and we came up to Richardson with that all, and moved into the house on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we all started school on Monday. And my grandfather came, and he lived with us, and he was in his 90s then. And my parents went out to the farm every Monday through Friday, Saturday before they came back in again. And and two cousins then yet stayed with us and went to school because their country school was closed. So at that time there were 4, 6, 7 of us going to school, and my grandfather stayed with us all the time.
And which grandfather was this?
Grandfather, Conrad.
And can you describe him for us?
Oh yeah, he was a tall man, and he had the whitest hair you wanted to see, and had every bit of his hair. And he smoked the pipe all the time. And he was very kind. And even if his teeth were gone, he, no matter what, I would be able to cook for him, because I would go home at noon from school and get some lunch together. We'd all go home for lunch and then go back to school, because at the time in Richardson we only lived 2 blocks from the school. And no matter, what he loved macaroni and cheese and rice and things like that, and scrambled eggs. And so I was able to fix any of that, for everybody, and we survived.
And so what was your relationship like with him, with your grandfather?
He was very, very nice to me, that later on in years, he hated to go to the barber and get shaved or get a haircut. And so my dad tried shaving him a couple of times. He hated that because he made him put his head back too far. Then my mother would shave him, And I started shaving him after I was, probably a junior, senior in high school, and then even after I was married. And living with Adam out here, he would wait for me Sunday mornings to stop there and shave him with a straight razor. You had to shave him. He was wrinkled, and you had to pull his skin apart and shave him. And he always said, it doesn't hurt, if you cut him a little bit. And he'd keep right on, encouraging you to shave him. And I must have shaved him for about 7 years after we were married in 1950. And then maybe 6, I should say 6, because he then went to live with his oldest daughter, and she lived at New Salem, and he did die down there at New Salem.
And how old was he then?
He was 96, 97 years old, yes.
And what would you consider your fondest memory of your grandfather?
Him playing cards all the time by himself. He had a bedroom and a bed by himself in this house. And in there he had a card table. And he would deal out these cards for whist and for 4 people to play. And he would pick up each hand and played it exactly as that person would play it. And that was his entertainment all day long. He didn't listen to a radio much or anything like that. He would check the weather outside and take a walk around the house or up the street and back. But he played a lot of those cards and things. And maybe Aunt Marion told you about him, because, she got to really know her father then when he lived with us in Richardson.
And did he ever ever talk about his home in Russia?
Yes, he and my dad would talk about it a lot in German and stuff. But I was in high school, and I was so glad to hear people speak English that you just didn't pay that much attention to them. And to this day, I'm sorry I didn't, because they had quite the conversations going on, talking about the different things they did in Russia. Because, my father was 19 years old when he came to the United States, when they came over here. So he remembered a lot. And then, my grandfather came over in 1913.
Did your father ever talk about?
Right, the two of them together. And they talked about it a lot, with different people that were Germans from Russia. And one thing that, what amazed me was they would tell you where they were born in Russia and where they were at. And when you looked at a map, this is Adam's father, and my father got to be very good friends, the families did, even before we got married. And they spoke the same German language, which amazed me. The same lingo, same everything. And because where they would tell you they were born, and you look at a map, they were born, a couple of thousand miles apart. And we were, Adam's dad and his family, the Haucks, came from the Crimea, where my parents and my father and his family, came from Katherine and Karlsruhe. And the distance was way too far in Russia for me to ever think they got together. But then when Adam and I made our first trip to Germany, we toured all of Germany and Europe in 1981. And then I kept, looking in the different phone books as we traveled around, trying to see where these people lived. And when we got to the Black Forest, we were at a casino there. I noticed, a telephone book, and it was the size of a big Sears Roebuck catalog. And I started going through that telephone book looking for dolls and Haucks. And here I found a page of all dolls and in the same area called Karlsruhe, Germany, where they were living at, that they were neighbors, side-by-side neighbors. That's why they spoke that same German lingo. And then when they went to Russia, they just, the families must have just kept up the same German language.
And then when they came to the United States, they still had that.
They still had that same, dialect to all their German language.
Did they talk about the commonalities they had back in Russia before they, when they moved here? Did they talk about?
Yes, they would talk about different things, where in my father and his family, they mostly, were grain farmers, or I think my grandfather was a laborer working for other people, mostly that owned the land, where Adam's parents then over in Crimea, they had their own farm and everything, which they sold to a Jew, they said, before they came to America then. And Adam's dad was 16 when he came to America, and he was the youngest of 7 brothers. And
so were a lot of those traditions brought?
Along with them, oh yes.
And you said your father he was a grain farmer?
Uh-huh.
Did they have any animals that they raised in addition to that?
Over in Russia?
Here, when they
Oh yes, he run cattle just as well as mostly Hereford and red cattle. We had milk cows. We always had about 20 to 30 milk cows that had to be milked, and then he had ranch cattle too all the time, and horses that they did the fields with at first. But by the time I was a youngster, though, they were into tractors and But they still had the thrash machine and still used the horses at the time to haul the grain to the thrash machine and all that. In fact, when Adam and I, we talked about getting married, and my brother, Matt, he was getting married the same fall. The one thing about my parents they always said you had to wait. Most of us in that family got married in October because you had to wait until the thrashing and the harvest was over with. And so Adam and I got married on October 9th in 1950. And my brother, Matt, and Ann got married on the, I should look it up. I think theirs was the 16th. Oh, yeah, it was 7 days later. The 16th of October. And then before Adam and I could go on our honeymoon, which we were going out to the West Coast, I had to go out and help my mother cook for a thrashing crew that whole week after we got married. And we butchered all the chickens that were used to serve at the wedding and baked all the pies. And had a thrashing crew for the whole week. And Adam, they had him out in the fields. He would help the guys, they called them spike pitchers, help the different guys load up their wagon with bundles before they brought them in through the thrash machine.
And how long? Was it just a week-long process for the threshing then?
Right, for us it was a week long that whole week that we were there.
And you mentioned making all the food with your mother. What kind of food would you make, and when would you serve it?
For a thrashing crew? Well, if whoever stayed there with you, some of the neighbors went home to their own houses, to sleep. But they would serve breakfast, which would always be bacon and eggs and toast and all that, and for breakfast. And then there would be lunch sent out to the thrashing crew in the morning about 10 o'clock, which was sandwiches and cookies and something baked or a cake, and coffee and juice. And then they came into the house for the noon meal, which would have been chicken, mashed potatoes, and some vegetable, and lettuce probably, and vegetables from the garden mostly. And then in the afternoon you did the same thing. About 4 o'clock, lunch was sent out to the thrash machine and made up and put into a big container with coffee and juice and water and sandwiches and cookies and cake and things like that. And then for the evening meal, they would work until dark, and then they'd come in for the evening meal.
And was it just you and your mother, or did any of your other siblings stay in home?
Well, speaking of right after our wedding, the other girls, the 3 younger sisters that I have, they were in school in Richardson.
And did you get along well with your siblings then?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us the order it went in when they were born?
And what year?
Well, you don't have to give me the year. You can just tell us.
I need a piece of paper if I'm going to tell you the year they were born. Tilly, her real name was Otelia. She would have been born in 1918. And then George. George, you usually abbreviated it, when you wrote it. And then Katherine, and we called her Kay. Then Joseph, his name was Joe. And then Lee, and his real name was Laborious, but he always went by the name of Lee. And then next one would have been Matthias, but he went by the name Matt. Then myself, Millie. And then Magdalene, we called her Maggie. and then Celestine, and we called her Sally. And then Bertha was the youngest, and her name kind of, when she was young, got to be Putsy, and then later on Bert. And we were usually born 2 years apart. Seemed like my mother breastfed every baby, and that kind of was her birth control. And then we did have a younger brother after Bertha, and his name was Jonathan, named John, but he had a respiratory deal right from the beginning, so he only lived about 2 days before he died.
And speaking of all of your brothers and sisters, and you were one of the youngest, but do you remember any of the younger ones when they were born?
Yes, because my mother, like I say, would always have a doctor, and Grandma would be there, and even neighbor ladies that would be midwives would come and help out. And I just remember her having these, the last, 2 of the girls in a way, and the last one, which was a son. They were born in the bedroom, which was their bedroom, and later on, somebody, after the baby was cleaned up and everything, they usually had it in their rocking chair that I have sitting right there. My mother used that to rock every one of us, and they would have probably a feather stick or something in that rocking chair, and they'd put the baby in there for everybody to see. Wrapped in blankets, all cleaned up.
Did you get to hold them pretty soon after?
Shortly after that, yeah, they would let us hold them.
And was there any competition between you and your siblings growing up?
Not really, no.
And who did you get along with the best out of all of them?
My brother, that was 2 years older than I, and myself, we got to do a lot of chores together. Like feeding and slopping pigs and things like that. We would have a whole bunch of pigs too, and they needed water, during the day while we were home in the summertime, and feed them and go get the cows. And then we, like I say, my grandfather and grandmother lived about a half a mile from our house, and they had, my grandfather had 6 or 7 cows that he would milk and keep the milk and feed it probably to pigs and separate and sell the cream. And we would separate their cows. The cows would be in the same pasture, and then we always knew which were his and which were ours, and we'd go get them, and it always took two of us or more to do that, to go out and take the cows, that belonged to Grandpa to grandfather's house. He lives south, and then the rest of the cows were taken home to our farm and barn to be milked.
And how much time would that take to separate the cows and take them to your grandfather's?
Oh, well, we always wanted to spend a little time with Grandpa and Grandma, because Grandma would always have something there for us to eat, some cookies or something. And so I'd say about 40 minutes to an hour. If we used a horse, it was, we could do it quicker, but most of the time we'd do it walking and running.
And I want to talk a minute about your grandmother since you brought her up. Can you tell us where she was born and her name?
I'd say now she was born in Karlsruhe, and her name was Katherine. Her maiden name was Kautzman.
And can you describe her for us?
Well, my grandfather was real tall, and where she was short, and stout and heavy. And she always had the white hair that I remember pulled back into a bun. And what Grandma said more, my grandfather wasn't as bossy as my grandmother. What she wanted done, she got done because she told you what to do. And he was just different that way, you know. He always looked out for you and really treated you with kindness and stuff. Well, she did too, but like I say, she more or less was the bossier one in that family between the two.
And what was your relationship like with her?
Good, good. We loved having our grandparents that close to us, you know. We got along really well with them.
And,
they treated us really well.
You mentioned she made snacks for you. Can you kind of tell us what kind of...
Well, if she had baked bread that day, she made sure we'd come into the house and have a piece of jelly bread, you know, with jelly on it, and probably even a glass of milk or juice or water. And she baked cookies all the time and cakes. She was a very good baker, a very good cook.
Did she make a lot of traditional meals?
I remember snacks more so than I do a regular meal at her house.
Did your mother make a lot of German-Russian meals?
Oh yeah, my mother, you know, would bake bread probably once or twice a week for a family like that. And then you would always have Dampfnudler at noon, which were made out of the bread dough. And our evening meals were a lot cooked milk with fine little noodles in it or something like that. We always had, you know, chicken and ham and beef. That was always available. And stuff would be cured, you know, like the hams and the sausages and stuff that they would usually butcher the pork in the fall.
Can you describe the butchering process and what that day was like?
All I know, it always got to be a real long day because they would, you know, have the pigs, and then the pigs were stabbed in the throat and then held to bleed, and they saved the blood to make blood sausage. And what I got to do quite often was they would put this blood sausage into a nice little clean pail and give you a wooden spoon, and you had to keep stirring it to keep it from gelling. And I know I got to do that a lot, you know, while they were butchering. And then they would have all this hot water, and they'd scald them, and they'd scrape the skin until all the hair were off. And then they were, you know, hung up to cool. And probably the next day that they were cut up then for sausage or hams or bacon or whatever they were making out of them.
How would they make the sausage?
Well, the sausage from the pork, you know, with whatever that they cut off from what they were making, a ham or a bacon, or the meat would be cut off of the bones and stuff like that, and ground up, and then a seasoning added to the ground up meat, and then there was a sausage stuffer, you know, where the casings were made from the intestines of the pig. They were, you know, usually the ladies or my mother got to clean those. They had to be scraped, you know, and then they were really thin, you know, like real fine paper, and that's what they used then on a stuffer to stuff the sausage that they had ground up and added all this seasoning to, and garlic and onions and whatever.
And did those tear easily when they were being cleaned?
Some did, but that's when, you know, they cut them, and then, you know, because they were quite long all the time, so it didn't make any difference what size those casings were to stuff, as long as they were able to put them onto the end of the machine.
And did you have a favorite type of sausage?
I liked them all, you know. The bread sausage, or what we call the pork sausage, and I liked the head cheese, which was made out of just the heads of the pork, and the blood sausage, that they added the blood to, if it was fried good. I liked them all.
And what about the cattle? Did the family butcher cattle for the winter as well?
Yes, and yes, there would always be, you know, probably even twice a year that there would be a big beef that got fattened, you know, that got cut and cooled. And sometimes some of the meat, you know, was canned into jars, you know, to keep it longer, or they hung it down, you know. And I remember that we always had an ice house, which was built into the ground with a roof on it, you know, that you could go down into this ice house, and they would cut the ice in the wintertime, and that would pretty well keep it cool all summer long too. You know, you'd always be able to find ice underneath all the straw that they would put over it and things like that.
And stay on food here for a minute. Did your mother have a garden?
Always. We always had a big garden.
And what kind of food did she grow in the garden?
Every kind of vegetable. Potatoes got to be planted first, and then peas, lettuce, and radishes. And then cucumbers. You know, everybody would wait for the first 2 cucumbers of the summer because that was a later crop. And they needed a lot of water in order to grow, and the carrots and the beets and the squash and the pumpkins and the watermelons, we had all of it.
And what about canning and preserving those materials?
Yes.
How did she do that?
Mostly with a canner. The water bath method, you know, was mostly used. And vegetables were put into the jars and then sealed, and liquid added to the jar in order to seal them, boil them enough then to seal the covers onto the jars.
And where did they store these after they were canned?
Usually in the cellar, and then the house we lived in, the cellar was mostly dirt on the floor, and so that kept pretty cool during the summer.
And what about during did you ever help in the garden as well?
Oh yes, we all got to work in the garden. Pull weeds. We had flowers, and it's still something that I love to do. It's one of my favorite things. I can spend all day outside just pulling weeds. And now that I'm alone, I practically do. I'll forget to come into the house even to eat for myself, or I'll try and grab something and eat it on the run. But I love being outside, and I love gardening, and I love flowers, and so I do a lot of that, and I keep it right up.
So that's something that is just kind of stayed with
Yes,
you all these years?
yes, yeah. Because then when my parents lived in Richardson, they had a big garden there too, and the first thing my dad did, well, I remember when we moved to town, was plant apple trees, raspberries, strawberries. We had all of that of our own.
So you had a lot of fruit on the farm?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what would your mother do with all of this fruit when it ripened?
Well, when they got to have electricity, you know, moved into the country and to the farms, well, then freezers and refrigerators were available then for everybody, and they kept the fruit that way. But before that, it was canned, or maybe, you know, kept cool for a week or two or three in an ice house that we had.
And you mentioned electrification. When did that come to your family's farm?
I would say 1947, 48.
And how did this change life on the farm?
Well, that's why I say it made a big difference, because then some of the first things that were bought were refrigerators, a refrigerator for the house, and freezers to keep the food in, and then it was a lot easier processing the food, that was kept, that was raised.
And did this also change the way the family would do laundry?
Yes, yeah, because, well, you would have the wash machine, that would be run by electricity.
And how was laundry done before that in your family?
The water was boiled in big tubs on a cold stove, and then at the wash machine, I remember the wash machine we had as a youngster had a motor on it. That motor had to be started, by choking it, and I had a pedal on it that you had to push down on that started up the wash machine.
And what about ironing clothes? Did you have to do that?
And oh yes, because having those 4 older brothers, well, my oldest sister left home when she was 18, but then my second oldest sister, Kate, she was there until she was 21. But after that, after she left, I got to do a lot of ironing too, because mostly for Sundays, going to Sunday church, the 4 boys always wore white shirts, and so did my dad. And we girls were always dressed in 2 dresses, and all of those clothes had to be washed and ironed during the week for the next Sunday to take us all to church again.
And
so we would have flat irons, that would be put onto the stove and heated up, and then you ironed with them. Oh, I learned to iron with them.
And speaking of clothing still, were most of your clothes store-bought or were they homemade?
While my sister Kay was still at home, most of them then were homemade. But then after I started high school and stuff, most of our clothes were bought. My mother still did some sewing, but her hands were getting quite crippled. She had arthritis really bad. The last I remember her doing was making quilts more, so with old material she had on hand.
And did you learn how to sew or embroider a quilt at that time?
Oh, yes.
And who taught you? Was it your mother or your sisters?
My mother mostly, and then when I started high school, I was in 4-H, and we were trained to sew then too.
And what about new shoes? How often did you get new shoes?
We probably got new shoes twice a year, that you would get a pair of new shoes for Easter, and you would wear them all summer long, and you always got to have an Easter bonnet when I was little, and, you always needed a light coat, And most of our clothes were ordered, either out of the Sears Roebuck catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog. And then in the fall of the year, when it got to be colder, you got another pair of new shoes that were heavier, that you could use all winter long. And then you always needed overshoes to go with them and all that.
And what was your favorite season?
Well, I suppose the springtime of the year. After you didn't have to go to school anymore, and like I say, we always seem to get nice new clothes for Easter.
I'd like to go to the family home for a minute. Where did you have to go to the bathroom during those years that you were growing up?
Let's see, we had an outdoor toilet. And then during the winter months, as little girls, and it would, be really cold and stuff outside, we had a pot in the basement which was used, and then usually my mother, I suppose, ended up carrying it out. And then when we had running water, I wish I'd remember what year that was put in. My dad dug a well up on a big hill right next to the farm. So then the water, he had the boys at that time dig a trench from that hill all the way down to the barn and over to the house. So we probably had running water and a bathtub, where the water would run into. It wasn't heated. You had to heat the water in order to take a bath in this bathtub. And then when the water would run on a pipe and would just run outside, onto the ground. And we had a sink that way too.
And what was the bathing process like? I mean, what did you use?
Like I say, we did have a bathtub. And I pretty well remember having that bathtub as long as I can remember back, that we took baths in.
And did everybody get a new change of water for it, or how did?
No, when there was 4 of us girls, 2 at a time were in the bathtub. So I'm sure it was, more than that, 4 people or more would get a bath in the same water.
And what about soap? Did your family make its own soap?
Soap, and then I remember having shampoo too, because I remember using mostly rainwater to shampoo my hair with all the time.
And what about teeth brushing? How often were you supposed to brush your teeth?
And I remember, from the time before we even went to school, that we each had, the county nurse would come around, and you would get a tooth brush at least once a year, and toothpaste. They kind of handed that out, right in the beginning of school each year. The county nurse was something that somebody, in the county that would come around to the farm homes and stuff and help people out. I'm sure they had to pay for the brush and the toothpaste and stuff, but she seemed like she was always the one that had it with her, that brought it along, shampoo. Well, and then there used to be the Watkins man, that would come around selling all those things too.
Now, Millie, I'd like to wrap up with some concluding remarks about your childhood. Can you tell us what your most stressful childhood experience was?
Probably having a whooping cough. I hated that because, my God, you coughed and coughed, and something else happened to us 4 girls when we were growing up. My father used formaldehyde to treat the wheat before it was planted, and he had it in a water jug, and we were in the water shed, or the pump shed, and if us girls didn't thinking it was water, and I must have been the first one, took a drink out of it, and my 3 sisters followed and did the same thing. And what we did was burn our throats and our mouths and everything, and had to be taken to the doctor.
And what did the doctor do at that point?
Try to relieve the pain we had in our mouth and our throat and stuff like that. And you know, did mouth rinses and thrush rinses around your mouth and things like that.
And when you had the whooping cough, what did they give you then for medicine?
I was trying to think of what it was. Some ugly tasting medicine. Trying to calm down that whooping cough, but I think our whole family probably came down with that whooping cough. At least the younger ones all did.
And how would that affect you then?
Oh, because the coughing? Because it lasted for a long time. I remember just really having it for about 2 weeks. And just really coughing all the time, no matter what, until you would throw up and all that.
It was a bad...
Yeah, it was a bad series.
Was it contagious then?
Well, yes, whooping cough was contagious, so we just passed it on one to the other, and I probably picked it up in school.
And now, in contrast to the stressful memories, what was your happiest time as a child?
Really relating with all my brothers and sisters and parents, you know. Our meals were always, everybody was at the table and everybody, you know, was eating at the same time and stuff. And those are some of my most memorable times, you know, is at the kitchen table. It was a big, long kitchen table with a bench in the back. And there were probably 6 of us that sat on the bench in the back, and then the rest of them around the side and the front of the table. And there was nothing better than a good meal and the conversation that went on the meal and the giggling and the laughing and all that.
And did all the kids have a seating?
We all kept our same seats all the time around the table.
So what was a typical meal like then for your family?
Well, it took a lot of food, like, you know, a spring chicken, which would have been one of your favorite meals, you know. It took 2 good-sized chickens, you know, to feed the whole family and things like that.
And was there always prayer and
A
talking?
prayer first, you know, you always had to say a prayer before you started to eat when everybody got to be there.
Now, what was the most adventurous thing you did in your childhood?
Probably being in Mandan and going to school there. I made some completely different kinds of friends, you know, while I was living with my uncle and aunt in Mandan. And I was there when they had the worst flood in Mandan, when all of Mandan got flooded and they were going down the main street with the rowboats. Before my parents were able to come and get me and take me home, and schools were shut down.
What was it like? Were you in one of those boats at some point?
No, I never was able, but we could see them from the windows, from the bedroom I had at my aunt's place, you know. All you had to do was go upstairs and look out the bedroom window, and you could see all this water and all these boats and all the things.
And your Aunt Nicole's house was okay?
Their basement got flooded, but the rest of the house never did, so they never really had to move out.
Well, is there anything else about your childhood memories that you would like to add? Anything that stands out?
I don't know, just learning to play all the different games that we were able to play at that time. Like Andy Over and Red Rover and with a ball, and Fox and the Goose was a big one during the winter time, and tag. We played a lot of tag, and you always hated to be it.
So what was your favorite game?
Probably with the ball, throwing it over a building and playing Andy Over.
And who would you usually play with?
My siblings, brothers and sisters.
And would the weather influence what you would play?
The weather? Yes, it would, you know. Some of those you could play during the summer and some of them in the snow in the winter.
So what was ball game would probably be a more springtime, summertime game. What was your
Yes.
favorite winter game?
Oh, going sled riding. We did a lot of sled riding. And playing Fox and the Goose and playing tag then too. And merry-go-round, you make a round circle. And later on I loved to jump rope. I learned how to jump rope, and that was a favorite of mine. And then once we moved to Richardson, we got a new bike, and we all took turns learning how to ride that bike. Well, I was the older one, and so I learned how to ride it first. And that was quite an ordeal, you know. You'd go up the hill and come down on the pavement and try and keep that bike going. But that was one of my favorites then, was bike riding. And then all my friends all had bikes too and would do the same thing.
Anything else that you would like to add?
My mind's going blank.
Well, can you tell us why you think it's important to tell your life story?
I think it's a very good idea. I just wish Adam would have been around, that we could have told our story together. We do have a book that we did for Dunn County, you know, with our life story in it. Then we had an interviewer here that asked some questions, and she taped it all, and then she went and she typed it up into a book form. I have that. And we got a book then for each one of the children, and they thought it was the most interesting thing that they had read, because like Dwayne said to me, he said, "Mom, do your personalities come through in that book? You know, we were quite different from each other."
And so what do you hope your children and grandchildren will learn from your history?
Well, I want to get some more genealogy done and make books out of it, you know, from my ancestors. And this Hauck book that I helped Dorothy Miller make, I have a book for each one of my grandchildren, and then here 2 years ago at Christmas time I decided to give them all these books. And I was amazed how interested they were all in their family history. And so I think this is a real good idea. And I hope they can all do it someday and go back on this.
So you hope they would take something from this and
Yes,
think about
yeah.
it. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that? Any
Yeah.
thoughts or observations?
Well, and I must say, you know, I've always belonged to the Catholic faith, and I enjoy my faith. This is what gets me through the day and every day.